Welcome to Chapter 10, Globalization of Ethical Decision Making. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to discuss the global values, goals, and business practices within ethics, understand the role of capitalism and economics as factors in ethics, assess role of multinational corporations, and the role of International Monetary Fund, which is called IMF. You should be able to assess the role of the United Nations Global Compact, the World Trade Organization, WTO, and explore and discuss common global business practices and gain awareness of the ethical issues that we have around the world. Let's look at culture, values, and practices on a global scale. We encounter cultures that may diverge from our own national culture when we engage in international business. And Hofstede's cultural dimensions that impact business environment looks at our individualism and collectivism, and it's looking at us as individuals and how our culture and our understanding of self and the world and our place in it. And then we look at the flip side is when you combine and you're merging in other people, right? When you're in your own bubble and you're coming from your family, you usually have different values and practices and beliefs formed based on your family upbringing. It doesn't matter whether it was a positive or negative one. It doesn't matter if what your religious views were. It's already is shaped then. Then you're thrust into public spaces, usually first in school, then into college, in the workforce, so on and so forth, that then those values and practices and beliefs can sometimes be in direct conflict with others because we are raised to believe that our way is the right way, right? So you're having to look at that. Power distance, the distance that we have from those in power, and the influence that we have on them and the influence they have on us, the uncertainty, avoidance, and then we have our masculinity and femininity. All of those you can read greater detail in Chapter 10. It's very interesting when you delve into that. Our self-reliance criterion is something that's unconscious to us, right? We really don't even know that we're referencing it. As I mentioned earlier, we have our different values and beliefs, experiences, and our knowledge, and it just is a natural reference point, but it's unconscious to us. Our cultural relativism is how we pull together what we deem as moral from one culture to another. And then, of course, there's this shared value system that goes clear across the board. There's just certain things that, as a whole, we all share. Like, for instance, we're all appalled when we see or hear about women and children being slaughtered. It's something that's just appalling to us as a whole. We have issues with those with mental and physical limitations when something is done to them. As a whole, society does not support the death penalty of people that are not mentally capable of really knowing right from wrong. I will say there are a few countries, and I won't be specific, that don't seem to care either way. But there's some common values across the globe, around the globe, that we share. And this helps us to form better relationships with individuals and also with organizations. So there's some takeaways from our previous recession. A lot of organizations were taking extreme risk. They knew they were in the red zone with their risks. They knew they were bending rules and engaging in an ethical activity. There was no question about it. They knew it. It's just whether or not they'd get caught. So there was a lack of transparency in the global financial market when it came to the decision-making process, accountability, and the accounting methods. That's hence why we end up having the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and some other regulator systems put in place to make sure that we can reduce this issue and the potential risks that can come in the future. And then, of course, there's risk compartmentalization, which occurs when profit centers within your organization are unaware of the consequences of their actions on the company as a whole. That can be detrimental because at that point they have free reign to do whatever, but they don't know what could happen if they cross this line. What happens if we do this? If there's no one saying this is what's going to happen if you do this and how it's going to impact us and how our company could bust, then they'll take the leap and you find out later that you've destroyed the entire company and your CEO's in prison. Now we have our economic systems. In the capitalist view, here are some early framers of this viewpoint. We have Adam Smith, who provided the idea of laissez-faire. You have John Maynard Keynes, who believed the state can stimulate economic growth and improve stability in private sector through government policies. And Milton Friedman believed that deregulation could reach equilibrium without intervention from government. Please read deeply into these three minds so that you can see how our framework for the country is basically here. We are actually, a lot of people would swear up and down we are 100% capitalist nation, but actually we are a blend of capitalist and socialism, and I'll explain to you why. Most people just see socialism as an economic system where wealth and power are shared and distributed evenly based on the amount of work that is expended in production. But it's more than that. Because if you look at social democracy, see, that's what happens where when you blend in that we're a democracy, it allows for private ownership of property, right? And features a large government that offers education and healthcare services to its citizens. So here's where they're the blend. So socialism in the United States, people don't think about it, but every social service that you have that is free to the American people is a form of socialism. Public education, Medicare, Medicaid, SNAP, the EBT, all of these different things that we have, that's a form of socialism. And so it's an ebb and flow within it. Capitalism helps to finance it, right? Because what happens is we all pour into these services through our taxes, and the only way we're able to do that is through the work we do. So it kind of balances out. And then, of course, the more businesses that we keep in business, they're paying tax into the system, blah, blah, blah. And it all kind of grows. But it's a morphed kind of thing. You do have some extreme capitalists who are trying to do away with a lot of the social service programs. They don't want the public schools. They don't want Medicare and Medicaid. So you can see where they're trying to. But at that point, then what you do is you can start to flip this country on its head. So there's a bimodal wealth distribution that's prevalent in most economies, and you can read further about that as well. We have different types of economics, rational and behavioral. In rational, you assume that people are predictable. They maximize the utility of their choices based on their needs and wants. There's an independent act on the basis of full and relevant information, while behavioral assumes that our decisions are influenced by our behavior, that we act irrationally due to genetics, emotions, learned behavior, and heuristics. So there's two different viewpoints, mindsets on that. One says we do everything based on needs and wants. The other one says we are all about our behavior. That's how we act. So 10.3 shows you the economic capitalism country differential, and you can see where we reign and how we flow. Interesting enough, you see the behavioral economics on the left, our rational economics on the right, capitalism on top, socialism on the bottom. And so before, Russia, now it used to be USSR, was more socialist, far left, along with China in the 40s, Sweden in the 60s. You see now they've leaned more towards a capitalist framework, leaning more over towards the rational economic side. The USA used to be more along the rational side, even more so towards socialism. It is now leaning more towards the left of behavioral economics, and reaching up more towards a capitalism framework. But you do see that we, in the 50s through the 90s, were very high rational, very high capitalism. So you see how the dip you have from the 30s to the 50s through the 90s. So you got a 40-year span that we were top scale rational capitalism. And then now we have gone far to the left side of behavioral economics, right? And it is more of a knee-jerk reaction. We're not focused on needs versus wants. We're focused on, once again, let me back up, right? We're focused on emotions. It's our learned behavior. The thing is that, interesting enough, that, and it can be manipulated through marketing, can be manipulated through media. Versus in the past, it was more along the lines of, what did your family need? And was that a want versus a need? And that was the mindset. Now it's just a knee-jerk decision. But you see, we're now far to the extreme left on the behavioral economic side, and more so than the other top nations of the world. It's very interesting, but you see Sweden is right in the middle of our behavioral and rational side, still leaning up towards a capitalistic approach. China has gone far over to the right. Of course, they're in the middle of between capitalism and socialism. But remember also that China and Russia also communist nations. So you see that they've switched for the most part over to a democratic convention, switching the lens. So it's all of these come into play, and what you have to realize is that in business you have to be mindful of it. You can't just have tunnel vision and a lens and a framework that is only focused on you and your country. But if you don't even see where your country lands on the scale of things, then you are uninformed and ignorant. And you have to be informed and empowered to understand, so that you can see how we all interact and how the moves that we make as a whole, as a country, how it impacts and can dictate to other nations. So people have heard of, and they talk about multinational corporations. Some don't even really understand what it means. But basically, you're operating on a global scale, and you're not limited to any one nation or region. You're all over, which is what it's interesting enough. I hear people and they can't stand big business. You can't stand big business. You can't stand wealthy people until you are a big business and you are a wealthy person. Because if you're saying, I just want to start a business and I only want, 1 to 5 employees, that's it. I'm just going to stay right here in Atlanta. I don't want any other growth. Then that's fine. But there's other people who have these dreams of, I want to have operations in, 15 different U.S. cities. I want to have operations on every continent. Well, at that point, you're multinational, right? And there's some criticisms to it because, of course, there can be potential misuse and misallocation of very scarce resources. That you exploit the few resources that a country has. And what happens is what happens when those resources are gone? Then what are you going to do? You can possibly cripple the economy of a country. You're limiting the potential for the people in that country, and you're directly having an impact on them, because once those resources are gone, most likely your company will pull out. Well, there goes jobs, there goes an economic stream, there goes a tax base. So you can really cripple a nation. There's a criticism about exploiting labor markets of the host country. Why you're coming in there, and in your country you would have to, pay a rate of $20 an hour, but you can now go into this other country and pay a rate of, $2 a day. You're exploiting the labor market. Issues of unfair competition have been criticized. Why? Because sometimes when you're building on a scale that big, you then can form monopolies in areas, and you're then the one and only source in that area, and you establish relationships with the distributors and vendors, and you can block out competitors from coming into those markets or from having a fair shake in those markets. Another criticism is failing to carry an appropriate share of the cost of social development, where you're going into these areas and you don't feel the need to be socially responsible and to help build up the people in that country, because you're like, they're not my people, I'm from America. Okay, but you built this huge corporation and you're benefiting off the labor of these people. What are you doing to help the communities that you're in the surrounding communities? What are you doing to make sure that they have a living wage and they can actually have some growth and vitality? And that is a criticism of multinational companies. Now, they do support Business for Social Responsibility, which tracks the different issues and trends that are emerging. It provides information on leadership and best practices. They do educational workshops and training, and they assist in developing practical business tools, ethics tools for organizations. Here are some top global organizations that you should always know about. You'll hear about them, especially if you pay attention to any of the financial newspapers, publications, and media outlets. And there's the IMF, which they regulate all monetary relationships between national economies, so between countries. They promote responsible global business conduct. And so they're making sure that no one is taking advantage of anyone else. That their goal is to try to reduce that. The goal is to try to ensure that bribery and other misconduct are not on the high rise. WTO, the World Trade Organization, they provide legally binding ground rules for all commerce and trade amongst all nations. So both importing and exporting of products. They facilitate trade negotiations, and they help to settle disputes amongst nations that are having issues as well. Both organizations, let me back up really quick because I want to make sure. Both organizations, of course, have also have their fair list of criticisms as well, um, both from outsiders but also insiders. Some who are still with the organizations, some who are no longer with the organizations. So do your research on both because it's very interesting to see the details and the impact they've had, as well as the claims that are made against them. The UN has a global compact which is focused on human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. The two principles of human rights is that businesses should support and respect the protection of internationally proclaimed human rights, make sure that they're not complicit in any abuses. In labor, the four principles that guide this compact are that businesses should uphold the freedom of association and effective recognition of the right to collective bargaining, and eliminate all forms of forced and compulsory labor. Right? There's no slave labor. You can't force people to work. You can't force people to, to do a 24-hour shift. The effective abolition of child labor. You're not going to sit up here and have these kids in these sweat factories. Eliminate discrimination in respect of employment and occupation. Those are the four guiding principles under labor. The compact has three guiding principles for environment: that there should be a supportive, precautionary approach to environmental challenges, undertake initiatives to promote greater environmental responsibility, encourage development and diffusion of environmentally friendly technologies, and then under anti-corruption, that businesses should work against corruption in all forms, including extortion and bribery. So let's look at some of the ethics issues that we have globally. Corruption, variations in international regulations, and supply chain issues. Corruption is not as though it is a case that corruption is everywhere in every country, including our own. And the problem with this issue is that defining corruption and outlining exactly what corruption is, because it is also a cultural phenomenon that some people do things and they don't think it's corruption, or some people do have the mindset, as we discussed in an earlier chapter, that, well, the rest of them are doing it, so what's the problem? Obviously, it's not a bad thing if everyone else is doing it. So corruption is huge because it's hard to track. It's very hard because you'll have people within government and within business who are in collusion with each other. Variations in international regulations. The regulations that are formed in the U.S. are not the same regulations that are formed in Rwanda, are not the same regulations that could be formed in the UK. They're not the same regulations that could be formed in China. And so you're having to see what your regulations are compared to others, because yours could be more stringent and someone else could be more relaxed. Yours could have a lot of loopholes and someone else's could be could be structured very well. And supply chain issues is the ability to how products are produced, packaged, and transported and brought to market. And you can have various issues, delays in that, complications in packaging, not following international standards, so on and so forth. Bribery. Oh, goodness gracious. Bribery falls right into corruption, right? Once again, it's one of those categories that are difficult because you have cultural considerations of what is considered a bribe, and the misinterpretation by one person versus another person. Oh, I don't see that as a bribe, but it is a bribe. Well, who says it's a bribe? Oh, you Westerners say it's a bribe. No, it's huge, and it's interwoven in so many elements from government, and you have public and private sector. You have in churches and all different religious organizations, and how everything is overlapped, and You have direct and indirect bribery. It is very intense. Antitrust activity. You have a vertical system where a business channel member has control of the entire system, and then it's done through ownership or contract, or through its ability to purchase, huge chunks or of companies or entities, and so it can be very convoluted, and it's an ongoing problem that is not going to get better anytime soon. We have issues with internet security and privacy, and the more we have these great hackers who love the challenge of a challenge, at the same time, you're exposing stakeholders, you're exposing the employees and the community. Here, they're sometimes trying to expose the corruption within an organization, but you're exposing, the public. You're exposing employees. You're not just exposing the top leaders, right? There's so much that's involved in that. And so our security and our privacy are at risk. Human rights violations are major. Because once again, you have people that have a different take on who is entitled to what rights. It says human. So it means everyone that's a human. Not everyone who's of a certain color, a certain gender, a certain religion, certain social economic status, human. And it's supposed to be clear across the board, but it's violations nonstop. Healthcare. Here in the United States, it's hilarious because here we are, the leader of the free world, yet we cannot get our healthcare system to look even remotely like some of the other best systems in the world. And of course, people then say, oh, there's so much like socialism. Okay, well, we're dying off like flies. We have the highest obesity rate in the world. We have the highest rate of most treatable diseases. And we're the wealthiest nation in the world. Something's wrong with that. So this is a huge issue. And then, of course, you then have countries that have less wealth than we do, less access, less resources, and fewer entry points and access points to resources, who are also in desperate need of healthcare. So you have the two extremes. Labor and the right to work, dealing with our right to work and our right to join trade unions. Interesting enough, here in the U.S., you've got a certain specialty group, special interest groups that are focused at destroying unions, because unions are the voice of the worker, and they don't want the workers to have a voice. So they have strategically, over the years, found ways to bully employees to not be able to form or join unions and have a collective bargaining and collective voice. And then, of course, our gender pay inequality still to this day. Once again, the wealthiest nation on the planet, and women are getting 70 to 80 cents per dollar that the man is getting, even if we're doing the same work or more. So these are issues here just in the U.S. alone, and so they're the same issues elsewhere. If a man is getting $1 in another nation, that woman may not get paid at all, or she may get 10 cents on that dollar. It is a huge, huge, huge crisis, and is something that needs to be addressed globally. Compensation, our ability to have a living wage, and the look at the executive compensation package and how vastly it overshadows the living wage and the current wages of employees in an organization, and whether or not executives should be compensated based on the performance of an organization, or whether or not they should be compensated based on their specific performance. and how well they're doing in their job. And no, you should not get a bonus because your employees who are barely making ends meet are able to make you look good. This is the case in organizations worldwide. Consumerism. So our choices are straining the environment. Our desire to have the life of the rich and famous, right? The Robin Leach show that used to be on in the 80s and 90s is actually putting a major strain on the environment. We have more cars on the roads. We have more motorcycles on the road. We're taking more plane trips. We're consuming more resources. It is putting a major strain on the environment worldwide. The made to break or planned obsolescence. Read on that. It'll be interesting to get your viewpoint on that as it's tied to consumerism. So some important things to consider when making your decisions within a global business is to incorporate your global and domestic issues in your risk management strategies. Formulate your own ethics codes for a global approach. Appoint your officers or committees to oversee and handle your global compliance issues, and provide extensive and exhaustive training to your employees on all levels. That is it for Chapter 10. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me. Thank you.